Trying to buy a new receiver can be daunting, confusing, and downright overwhelming when you're not sure what to look for when making a purchase. So I'm going to share 10 tips to help you buy a new AV receiver in 2022. And make sure you stay till the end of the video for a bonus tip. Let's discuss. I think this one is pretty obvious by now, but the first thing you always want to do is give yourself a budget, whatever that may be. Unless you've got endless pockets stacked with cash, you'll want to set a budget, and this requires doing some research to see what current prices are, especially in 2022 when inflation is now at 8%. But if possible, try to give yourself $100 to $200 of leeway just in case. Or you can set your budget and then factor in 8% for inflation. You'll want to figure out how many devices you have because this will determine how many HDMI inputs you'll need when buying your new receiver. Most receivers typically give you 6 or 7 inputs. If you're buying an entry-level receiver that doesn't have as many bells and whistles, it may only come with 5 inputs, which is probably enough for the general consumer, but home theater enthusiasts usually have somewhere around 7 or 8 devices or more. Once you've set your budget and determined how many devices you have, now you can really start searching for your receiver. And the reason you want to get enough inputs is because you want to essentially future-proof yourself. Maybe you only have 5 devices right now, but technology and standards are always changing, and you might want to add other devices in the future. So if you're able to buy a receiver with more inputs than you need, this is great for future expansion because when you buy your receiver, you're stuck with however many inputs it comes with. You won't be able to add more inputs, so make sure you get more than what you need if your budget allows it. It's a great time to be a home theater enthusiast because there are some really great codecs out there for object-based surround sound. And more receiver companies are giving you multiple options to include in your theater. Now, the main codecs for audio that you'll see on receivers are Dolby Atmos and DTS-X, as well as their legacy counterparts. Now, this is pretty much the standard. Some entry-level receivers only include legacy formats like Dolby True HD and DTS Master Audio. But there are entry-level receivers that do include object-based codecs. And then there's the black sheep of the object-based surround sound codecs, RO3D. And the reason why I say it's the black sheep is because 95% of receiver manufacturers do not include RO3D because there's little to no content anywhere to be found on Blu-ray discs and streaming services, at least in the US. And if you do import Blu-rays with RO3D, you probably won't be able to decode the codec unless you have a higher end receiver that supports the format. Not to mention, your Blu-ray player also has to support the format, and RO3D has different speaker configurations than Dolby and DTS. I have an RO3D demo disc, but no RO3D capable, well, anything. The audio just outputs a DTS track.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? You are about to experience now the future of sound based on a revolutionary new system called RO3D.
So it makes me think that RO3D's base codec is DTS, kind of like how Dolby Atmos and DTS-X sits on top of Dolby True HD and DTS Master Audio. And Atmos and DTS-X are just the metadata. So you'll more than likely be able to play RO3D content without an RO3D capable receiver. You just won't get the metadata for the object-based audio. So really, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for companies to include a codec like RO3D on their devices and have to pay royalties for a codec that is basically non-existent in the US market. And then there's the video codec side. There's Dolby Vision, Dolby Vision IQ, HDR10, HDR10 Plus, and IMAX Enhanced. Now, I'm not going to go over all these codecs in this video, but if you want to know the difference between all these different codecs, I do have videos on my channel explaining what they are and how they work. So I'll link them in the description. Make sure you check them out. But when you're shopping for a receiver, you want as many options as possible, again, for future-proofing. The last thing you want to do is buy a receiver, get home, set it all up, only to realize it won't play nice with the rest of your devices because it doesn't support a certain codec. So make sure you do your research so you get the most bang for your buck. This is where things start to get a little bit tricky. Most people will probably still be fine with HDMI 2.1, but for those of you with next-gen consoles and you want the best video specs available, you're going to want to go with an HDMI 2.1 receiver. Why? HDMI specification 2.1a is the most recent update of the HDMI specification and supports a range of higher video resolutions and refresh rates, including 8K 60 and 4K 120, VRR or variable refresh rate, and resolutions up to 10K. Dynamic HDR formats are also supported, and bandwidth capability is increased to 48 gigabits per second. 48 gigabits per second bandwidth also requires the new ultra-high-speed HDMI cable. The new cable ensures ultra-high bandwidth dependent features are delivered, including uncompressed 8K video with HDR. And HDMI 2.1 also supports eARC, or Enhanced Audio Return Channel, for devices that support it. But recently, there's been some confusion on what devices are legitimately HDMI 2.1 compliant. It turns out that TV and monitor companies don't actually have to support HDMI 2.1 features to claim HDMI 2.1 compliance. Let me explain. The HDMI 2.1 spec actually fully replaces the HDMI 2.0 spec, rather than simply upgrading it. So any manufacturer that supports HDMI 2.0 level features is technically supporting HDMI 2.1 because the HDMI 2.0 spec doesn't exist anymore. And the features we think of when we talk about HDMI 2.1, including FRL, fixed rate link, variable refresh rate, VRR, auto low latency mode, and the enhanced audio return channel, eARC, are technically optional. So be very careful when you see the HDMI 2.1 designation on your receiver or on anything. So then, how do you verify that a receiver is actually HDMI 2.1 compliant? For example, if you have dynamic HDR, which is only in version 2.1, then you already know that it is real 2.1 because no other HDMI version supports it. The same with the variable refresh rate, or VRR, and eARC. If it does support it, then it's definitely HDMI 2.1 because no other version can support it. Gone are the days of picking up your remote, hitting the menu button, and pulling up a menu on-screen overlay to tinker with the settings. Well, maybe not quite, but more and more companies are starting to offer a web interface on their receivers and processors. Now, why is this beneficial? Because instead of having to rely on a remote that you might not be able to find, or a clunky GUI, or maybe your receiver or rack is in an entirely different room, having a web interface gives you remote access from any device with a web page. A web interface gives you the utmost flexibility when it comes to device setup. Using a phone, tablet, or laptop, owners can easily access any function or setting and make changes on the fly and remotely on your network. Now, the web interface implementation will differ from manufacturer to manufacturer, but the concept is still the same. Anthem products, for instance, give you complete and total remote control, as well as setting up your device, even with Arc Genesis room calibration, if you own the latest line of receivers. Hey, what's up? You've made it this far in the video, so welcome to the channel and thank you for watching. If this is your first time visiting the channel and you're enjoying the content that I produce here, why don't you go ahead and do me a solid, hit the subscribe button, let your friends know about the channel, and hit the bell notification so you know when I post new content. And If you're enjoying this video, why don't you go ahead and hit the like button? It'll help the channel grow, and I would greatly appreciate it. All right, well, I guess that's it. I'll let you get back to the video. If you don't know what pre-outs are, many mid-level and up receivers allow you to bypass the internal amps on your receiver and hook up separates, or external amplification. It means you can add extra power to your home theater. The audio signals come unamplified from your AV receiver to the external amp, which then amplifies it. So your AV receiver's duty is performed by an external amp. The speakers are connected to the external amp instead of your AVR. Well, what are the benefits of using pre-outs? It reduces the strain on your receiver. AV receivers are typically doing all kinds of processing and tasks all at once, including powering those big beefy full-size tower speakers plugged up to your receiver. Receivers can also put off a lot of heat, and heat is the #1 enemy of electronics. So offloading power amplification externally means your receiver doesn't have to work as hard, therefore extending the life of your electronics. Moreover, external power amps perform better than the built-in amp of the AVR. An external amp is more powerful, hence you get improved audio quality. So if you want a receiver with flexibility and expandability, you should opt for an AV receiver that has pre-outs, like this receiver. These are pre-outs. Normally you would connect your speakers to these speaker terminals. Instead, you would connect your external amplification to the pre-outs, and then you would connect your speakers to the external amplification. This one probably isn't as important as the other tips on this list for most people, but it's still something you should consider. AirPlay, Spotify, Dune, DTS Play-Fi. What do all these have in common? They're all music streaming services that people use. Well, AirPlay isn't a streaming service. AirPlay lets you share videos, music, photos, and more from Apple devices to your Apple TV, favorite speakers, and popular smart TVs. And what you share always stays personal and private. But in this case, we're just talking about music. If you're really big on being able to fling your music around the house wirelessly using your phone, tablet, or even your voice, most receivers offer most of the big streaming services, even on entry-level receivers. But if you don't care about music or streaming services, and you just want to listen to your music in your theater wirelessly, then you'll want to make sure that the receiver you're looking at has either Bluetooth or AirPlay. So I was a little bit apprehensive about this tip because not every company gives you this option. In fact, there are very few. But there are companies who give you the option to make upgrades to your equipment. And no, I'm not talking about software or firmware upgrades. I'm talking about legit hardware upgrades where you can add additional channels or even upgrade your HDMI board. For instance, Emotiva has products that are modular. Take the RMC1 for instance. The RMC1 is a 16-channel processor that is expandable to a whopping 28 channels. 28! The average consumer will probably never need nor have the space for that many speakers. But you have the option to add XLR expansion modules in pairs, aka stereo. However, it also comes at a premium price for just the processor at a staggering price of $5,000. Again, that's just for 16 channels. And it's a processor, so you still have to buy separate amps. And if you want to expand the channel count, that's more money. One pair expansion module will add on an additional $224. So if you were to expand the RMC1 to the full 28 channels, you're at around $6,300. Yikes. But hey, if you have the funds, then it's nice to know that the option to expand your unit is there. This might be the most important tip. Room correction is pretty much necessary for any room. Get this wrong, and it doesn't matter how expensive your equipment is, your speakers and your room could end up sounding like an absolute disaster. And not all room correction software is made equal. Most software comes with a cheap, janky mic and an even cheap, janky cardboard tripod. But some room correction is better than nothing. That being said, there are some really truly amazing room correction software on the market that does actually make a massive difference, especially if you have a lively room. But this is also where acoustical treatment is so important, because it will only help the room correction software be that much more effective. The less processing your room correction software has to do, the better. Now, I haven't tried them all, but I have used quite a few room correction software. I've used Odyssey's room correction software, which can be found on various manufacturers' receivers. I've used Pioneer's proprietary MCACC. I've used Onkyo's with Odyssey and their proprietary room correction AccuEQ, which is just absolutely horrible. I don't know, maybe it's better now, but I'd never buy another Onkyo if it had AccuEQ on it. And then there's Anthem's proprietary room correction, Anthem Arc Genesis. And Arc is by far the best room correction software that I have ever used, and I absolutely love it. The mic is legit, and they actually give you a real tripod. I mean, it's award-winning for a reason. So those are the main room correction softwares that you'll find. Now, I've never owned a Yamaha, so I can't speak on that. I've never tried Dirac, but I'm dying to, because I've heard nothing but amazing things about Dirac. So hopefully at some point, this channel will give me the opportunity to get some products with Dirac. And then there's the holy grail, the Trinnov Altitude processor. Now, I believe it also uses Dirac as well, but its microphone actually measures your room in 3D. Now, I'll probably never be able to afford a Trinnov like 99.9% of home theater and consumers, but it's my goal to get one at some point. Okay, I kind of went off on a tangent there, but you want to make sure you use some type of room correction, whether it's pre-installed on your receiver or you go the manual route with something like REW and an SPL meter. You are going to need to do room correction, and you'll really want to treat your room acoustically first, if you can, because those two things, it can drastically affect your home theater experience. Receivers have multiple channels with their wattage rating, but how many watts per channel do you actually need? For most people, you probably only need around 70 to 100 watts per channel due to how loud the range is on the content that you're watching. Now, once you go into higher end receivers, you'll find this number increasing because the more powerful sound is demanded of AV receivers that cost thousands of dollars more. Another thing to consider is that a receiver should be bought based on the other equipment that you have, namely the speakers and the subwoofer. It's very important to remember that a receiver won't make lower quality speakers suddenly sound amazing. A receiver is meant to get the most out of a speaker, not magically make it a much better device than it actually is. And room size matters. Now keep in mind that the smaller your room is, the less of a powerful sound you'll need. So you'll start to face diminishing returns pretty quickly if you're using a 200 watt per channel receiver in a small room. This is because movies and games tend to have a high dynamic range of sound. The more powerful the amplifier is, the more oomph there will be when something loud happens, such as an explosion. And the difference can be noticeable when comparing 85 watts versus 150 watts, because the receiver with more watts per channel has a larger power reserve and can handle sudden bursts of loud noises. Weaker amplifiers may distort these sounds, creating an experience that can be difficult to diagnose if you don't know where to look. A lot of times, companies will put a relatively high watts per channel rating in the product description, but fail to indicate that it's only capable of that power output for about a second or two, or that it only applies to using 1 or 2 channels at a time. Most companies rate their channels at 2 channels driven. So if you see a receiver claiming 150 watts a channel, it's more than likely 150 watts with only 2 channels active. So if you have a 7-channel receiver and you're doing 2-channel listening, the other 5 channels are not active, and if the amplifiers in your receiver are efficient, then you should be getting that 150 watts claimed. But once you start watching movies and TV shows where most or all the channels are being used simultaneously, that 150 watts per channel drops considerably across all channels. And most companies are very vague about releasing how many watts are actually being output with all channels driven. So be very careful when you're looking at power ratings. This is why, if you can, I'd highly encourage you to use separates and pre-outs if you have the funds and the option on your receiver. Now it's time for Query of the Week. This week's query is, have you bought a new receiver in 2022? If so, what brand did you buy and what configuration are you using in your theater? All right, everyone, that's going to conclude it for this video. Hopefully you found these 10 tips very helpful when trying to buy a receiver in 2022. I know it can be absolutely daunting and confusing sometimes. Sometimes you don't know what to look for. Sometimes you don't know what companies are actually advertising. So hopefully this video helps you if you're looking to buy a new receiver in 2022. And if you did find it helpful, why don't you go ahead and hit the like button and make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss my other videos in the future. And hit that bell notification so you'll be notified when I do upload new content. As always, I will see you guys in the next video. I'm Haterade Cowboy, and this is Haterade Cowboy Cinema.